The prison at the heart of one of Britain's most beloved sitcoms never existed because the Home Office refused to let the BBC film inside a real one, and the entire interior of HMP Slade was built inside a disused, underwater filming tank at Ealing Studios. The story behind Porridge is full of near misses, unexpected decisions, and one loss that closed the cell door on everything that might have followed. Fact 1. It almost never happened. Porridge did not emerge smoothly from a confident commission. It began as one of 7 pilots produced for a 1973 BBC project called 7 of 1, in which Ronnie Barker starred in 7 different situations to see which might work as a full series. The pilot that became Porridge was called Prisoner and Escort, written by Dick Clement and Ian Lafreniere, and it introduced Norman Stanley Fletcher for the first time. Barker's own preference was for a different pilot from the same series, a sitcom about a Welsh gambling addict. He did not initially think Prisoner and Escort was the strongest of the 7. The production team disagreed and selected it for development. Had Barker's preference prevailed, the show that became one of the greatest British sitcoms ever made would not have been made at all. The writers had their own doubts. Clement and Lafreniere visited prisons as research and came back deeply troubled by what they saw. Dick Clement later told the Radio Times, "We went round prisons and got very depressed because the reality is they're not fun. The question of whether a prison could be the setting for a comedy was, in the early 1970s, genuinely uncertain." When the BBC finally gave the green light, Clement and Lafreniere had already given up waiting. They had crossed the river to London Weekend Television and written a different series, entirely a crime caper called Thick as Thieves, starring Bob Hoskins and John Thor. It was cancelled after 1 series. The BBC's eventual decision to proceed with Porridge brought the writers back, and what followed ran for 3 series, 2 Christmas specials, a spin-off, and a feature film. Fact 2. The prison that was a water tank. The Home Office refused to grant the BBC permission to film inside or outside any functioning prison. The refusal was absolute. No real prison, no real cells, no real location footage of any kind. The production team had to build everything from scratch. For the prison exterior, seen in the opening credits, the production used the gatehouse of the long-disused St Albans Prison in Victoria Street, supplemented by footage of HM Prison Maidstone. For external shots of prisoners in the grounds, a psychiatric hospital near Watford was used for the first 2 series, until the hospital withdrew permission after complaints from patients' families. The interior shots of doors being locked were filmed at Shepherd's Bush Police Station, where the BBC maintained a good working relationship with local officers. But the most remarkable solution was the main prison interior itself. Production designer Tim Gleeson converted a disused water tank at Ealing Studios, a tank that had previously been used for underwater filming sequences, into a multi-story prison set. The landings, the cells, the staircases of HMP Slade were all constructed inside a tank that had been designed to hold water. The result was so convincing that most viewers assumed the production had somehow gained access to a real Victorian prison. The claustrophobia that defines the show's atmosphere, the sense of a confined world with its own rules and hierarchies, was achieved entirely through design ingenuity. The Home Office's refusal, intended to restrict the production, inadvertently gave it a visual coherence it might not have had if filming had been spread across multiple real locations. Fact 3. Godber was Barker's second choice. Ronnie Barker had a specific actor in mind for the role of Lenny Godber Fletcher's young cellmate, the Birmingham-born first-timer whose naivety and essential goodness provide the emotional counterweight to Fletcher's world-weary cynicism. That actor was Paul Henry, who was from Birmingham and therefore had the regional authenticity the role seemed to require. The production team chose Richard Beckinsale instead. Beckinsale was not from Birmingham, he was from Nottingham. His Birmingham accent, which he initially attempted for the role, was eventually dropped entirely. The casting decision overrode both Barker's preference and the character's stated origins, and it produced one of the most celebrated double acts in British sitcom history. Beckinsale was already well known when he joined Porridge, having made his name in The Lovers on ITV. He was simultaneously appearing in Rising Damp on ITV while filming Porridge for the BBC, the only main cast member of Rising Damp who had not appeared in the stage production the show was based on. In the middle years of the 1970s, he was appearing in two of Britain's most popular sitcoms at the same time on different channels. The chemistry between Barker and Beckinsale was immediate and total. The relationship between Fletcher and Godber, the older man's protective cynicism, the younger man's stubborn hope, became the emotional heart of the show. Dick Clement later said that nothing in his writing career was as painless as Porridge, because literally nothing went wrong. The casting of Beckinsale was the decision that made that possible. Fact 4. Barker voiced the judge himself. The opening sequence of every Porridge episode begins the same way. A judge's voice intones the sentence over the sound of prison doors slamming shut, finding Norman Stanley Fletcher as a habitual criminal and dispatching him to 5 years imprisonment. The voice is authoritative, clipped, and entirely unlike the Cockney warmth of Fletcher himself. It is Ronnie Barker's voice. Barker recorded the judge's narration himself, playing both the condemned man and the authority figure condemning him. He later said he regretted it. The doubling felt, in retrospect, like a trick that drew attention to itself, a reminder that the same actor was playing two roles in the same sequence. In the third series, the judge's role in 2 episodes was taken over by the actor Maurice Denham. The theme music presented its own challenge. The production team decided that conventional title music was unsuitable for a comedy set in a prison. Something too jaunty or cheerful would jar against the setting. The solution was the booming judicial narration itself, followed by composer Max Harris's closing theme, which was deliberately given a music hall feel to reflect Fletcher's Cockney origins. Harris wrote the theme for the closing credits as something deliberately at variance with the dour comedy. The same Max Harris had written theme music for a number of other BBC productions, and would go on to write the theme for Open All Hours, the other Ronnie Barker sitcom that had emerged from the same 7 of 1 project that produced Porridge. The two shows that defined Barker's television legacy in the 1970s shared the same composer. If you're enjoying this, it would mean a lot if you subscribed. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Just hit that button and you'll never miss a new one. Fact 5. David Jason played an old man. One of the most striking guest performances in Porridge came from a young actor playing someone very much older. In the third series episode, Pardon Me, David Jason appeared as Blanco, an elderly long-term prisoner who claims to have been wrongly convicted and applies repeatedly for a pardon. Jason was in his mid-30s when he played the role. The character he was playing was significantly older. Jason had been in the television industry for several years by the time he appeared in Porridge, but he was not yet the household name he would become. He was at the point in his career where he was taking varied guest roles, some dramatic, some comic, building a range that would eventually lead to Del Boy Trotter in Only Fools and Horses, and then Frost in A Touch of Frost. The Blanco scenes were filmed in the grounds of a brewery outside Baldock in Hertfordshire, which had barred windows that approximated a prison exterior convincingly enough for the production's purposes. The building has since been demolished. It is one of several Porridge locations that no longer exist. The psychiatric hospital near Watford that served as the prison exterior for 2 series is also gone, leaving the St Albans Gatehouse as the most durable physical remnant of the show's real-world settings. Jason's performance as the elderly Blanco has been cited by many who worked on the show as an indication of what he was capable of well before his most famous roles arrived. The makeup and physical performance required to play a convincingly aged man were substantial challenges for an actor in his 30s. The results, by general agreement, were entirely persuasive. Fact 6. Barker ended it himself. Porridge ended in 1977, not because the BBC wanted it to stop, not because the writers had run out of material, and not because the audience had moved on. It ended because Ronnie Barker decided it should. The producers and writers were keen to continue. Barker refused. His reason was straightforward and often quoted. He was wary of being stuck with a character. Fletcher was so completely associated with him, so dominant in the public's imagination, that Barker feared the role would consume his identity as a performer if he continued indefinitely. He wanted to move on to other things. The decision was entirely his, and it was final. He did, however, change his mind once. After ending Porridge after 3 series, Barker had turned his attention to Open All Hours, the other sitcom to emerge from 7 of 1, in which he played the stuttering shopkeeper Arkwright. Open All Hours aired 1 series in 1976 on BBC Two and was not renewed due to low ratings. With that project stalled, Barker reversed his decision and produced a 3rd series of Porridge, as well as agreeing to the feature film adaptation. The Going Straight spin-off, which followed Fletcher after his release from prison, ran for 1 series in 1978 and was warmly received, winning 2 BAFTAs. Further series were planned. What ended those plans was not a creative decision, but a death. Fact 7. The BAFTA nobody wanted to win. Richard Beckinsale died on the 19th of March, 1979. He was 31 years old. His wife Judy Lowe was in hospital recovering from an operation when he went to bed on the night of the 18th and was found dead the following morning. The cause was an undiagnosed coronary artery disease. He had experienced symptoms, chest pains, dizziness in the weeks before his death, but his doctor had attributed them to a stomach complaint and slightly elevated cholesterol. 3 days after his death, Going Straight won a BAFTA award. Ronnie Barker was in the audience to accept it. His speech was brief and visibly distressed. He paid tribute to his co-star in a few short sentences and sat down. The award that should have been a celebration of a show they had both made together became instead a public moment of grief for a man who had died 3 days earlier at 31. Beckinsale had won 3 BAFTAs for 3 different sitcoms in 3 consecutive years: Porridge in 1977, Rising Damp in 1978, and Going Straight in 1979. The 1979 award was accepted by Barker on behalf of both of them. It is unlikely the record of 3 BAFTAs in 3 consecutive years for 3 different sitcoms has been matched by any British comedy actor since. Beckinsale's daughter, Kate, born in 1973 and 6 years old when he died, went on to become one of Britain's most internationally recognisable film actors. She has spoken in interviews about growing up without her father and about the experience of watching his work as an adult. The cheerfulness he brought to Godber, the warmth that made the character so different from Fletcher's cynicism, is visible in the recordings, entirely intact decades later. Fact 8. The episode that never left the cell. Among the many episodes of Porridge, one stands apart in terms of its structural ambition. The episode A Night In, broadcast in the first series, takes place entirely within Fletcher and Godber's cell. Neither character leaves the room for the full 30 minutes of the episode. There are no other locations, no other significant characters, and no plot that requires movement through the prison. The decision to confine the entire episode to a single room was not born of necessity. It was a creative choice that tested how much the show could sustain on character and dialogue alone. The result is widely considered by critics and fans to be the finest episode of the series. What it demonstrates, in 30 unbroken minutes, is that the relationship between Fletcher and Godber was strong enough to hold an audience without any supporting structure at all. The episode is partly a meditation on imprisonment itself, on what it means to be confined, to pass time, to find ways of maintaining dignity and humour in a situation designed to deprive both. Fletcher's line from the episode delivered to Godber, who is counting the nights he has left to serve, has been quoted more often than almost anything else in the show. "That's what you've got to tell yourself? You're just having a quiet night in." The episode works because Barker and Beckinsale had, by that point in the first series, built a relationship between their characters that felt entirely real. The cell was not a limitation. It was the show's natural habitat, and A Night In simply made that explicit by removing every other option and letting the 2 men talk. Fact 9. It was popular with real prisoners. Porridge was, according to accounts from the prison service at the time, immensely popular with actual inmates of British prisons during its original broadcast. The show was watched in common rooms and referenced in the daily language of prison life. Fletcher's strategies for surviving custody, his ability to work within a system without being destroyed by it, to find small victories in a large defeat, resonated with people living the reality the show was depicting. The writers were aware of this and took it seriously. The show's central argument that people in prison are still people, with humor and loyalty and a persistent capacity for human connection, was not a comfortable position to take in British public life in the mid-1970s. Prison reform was not a popular subject. Comedy about prisoners required a particular kind of confidence that the humanity of the characters could carry the premise. What the writers achieved was a show in which the prison system itself is treated as absurd rather than authoritative, and in which the prisoners are consistently more intelligent, more interesting, and more alive than the institution designed to contain them. This was not an accident. Clément and Lafrenière made deliberate choices about where the show's sympathies lay, and those choices are visible in every episode. The production designer Tim Gleason's water tank interior, the writer's refusal to make the prison a place of genuine menace, and Barker's performance as a man whose intelligence consistently outpaces his circumstances, combined to produce something that felt true to people who knew what it was like inside. The fact that the show was filmed in a converted underwater tank and never went near a real prison made no difference to that recognition. Fact 10. Barker's biggest regret. Ronnie Barker retired from performing in December 1987 at the age of 58. He opened an antiques shop with his wife Joy in Chipping Norton and largely withdrew from public life. He came back once, in 2003, to record in-character scenes as Fletcher for a BBC Christmas retrospective, a mockumentary that revisited what had happened to the Slade prisoners 25 years after the show ended. In that retrospective, Barker said something that he repeated in subsequent interviews whenever the show came up. "I feel I owe much to Porridge. It was probably the best and most important show I did." The man who had ended the series precisely because he was afraid of being defined by it had, by the end of his life, accepted that definition entirely and found it was not the trap he had feared, but the achievement he was most proud of. He died on 3rd October 2005. In his obituaries and tributes, Porridge was mentioned in almost every sentence. The judge's voice in the opening titles, the cell in the water tank, the character of Fletcher, that he himself had been reluctant to commit to all of it, had become inseparable from his name. The precaution he had taken in 1977, ending the show before it could swallow him whole, had not worked. But by 2005, he did not seem to mind. Royal Mail issued a set of special stamps in September 2024 to mark the 50th anniversary of the show's first broadcast. Norman Stanley Fletcher, the habitual criminal sentenced to 5 years in HMP Slade, had been served time in the British cultural imagination for half a century. He showed no signs of being released.